In this video, we'll finally put together the last 3 learning objectives and we'll graph a parabola fully by hand. Alright, so you already know everything you need to know. Now we just need to put it together and actually to create the final graph of the parabola. So when we're graphing a quadratic, there's going to be 3 things that I'm looking for on the skill check that you have exactly right. Alright, you should have the vertex, that turn where our quadratic happens exactly right. Your x-intercepts should be in the exact right place, and your y-intercept should be in the exact right place. All right, then just draw the parabola shape that connects those 3 dots, well, multiple dots. All right, so let's go through it. I want to graph this function, f of x equals x minus 3 squared minus 4. All right, it's in vertex form, so this is kind of the first thing to recognize when you're working with quadratics. Is it in standard form or vertex form? Because they kind of tell you different things. This one's in vertex form. So right away, I know my vertex is 3, negative 4. Right? Vertex form is useful because it just tells me what the vertex is. So 3, negative 4 is going to be my vertex. All right, the next thing I'll do is find the y-intercept. The y-intercept is when I plug in 0 into my expression. So again, all the things you've learned before, now you just have to kind of recall what each one is. All right, order of operations. Negative 3 squared first is 9. 9 minus 4 is 5. So that tells me at 5, I have my y-intercept. And then last one, my x-intercepts, I take my equation and set it equal to 0. And as we saw in the intercept video, if it's in vertex form, I tend to do the square root method. So I'm going to isolate the square by adding 4 to both sides. Then I can do the square root. All right, and remember, the square and the square root cancel. And also, whenever you take the square root of an equation, you have to get a plus or minus. And then add that 3 to the other side. 3 minus 2 is 1. 3 plus 2 is 5. So I get those 2 x-intercepts at 1 and 5. All right, so that's the first thing I'm going to look at when I'm doing a skill check. Did you get those 4 points in the exact right places? All right, and the last thing is knowing that it's a parabola, not connecting them in some weird way. All right, that line graph touches all the dots, but that's not right. All right, the graph that we want should be a parabola, and we know the vertex is that lowest point, so that's kind of where the turn should happen. All right, so my final graph should look like that. All right, a parabola that smoothly goes through the 4 points I have, making sure that vertex is the lowest point. All right, so that's the graph. This is exactly what I'd be expecting on the skill check if this is the type of equation you got. All right, for our next example, now it is in standard form. Standard form takes a bit more work, particularly to find the vertex. So if we want to find the vertex first, and we learned this 2 learning objectives ago, we have to complete the square. And in order to complete the square, we take that number b, which is negative 2. We divide it by 2 to get positive 4. Or sorry, divide it by 2 to get positive 1. Sorry, negative 1. I'm all over the place right now. Negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. And then we square that to get positive 1. So the thing we need to add to get a perfect square is plus 1. I remember, since we're working with the function notation, we add 1, we also have to subtract 1, so we don't actually change the function we're talking about. Those first 3 terms become x minus 1 squared. And those last 2 terms, negative 3 and negative 1, become minus 4. All right, so that tells me my vertex is going to be at 1, negative 4. All right, so that's my vertex down there. Standard form is at least easier to find your y-intercept because you just plug in 0. And all the terms with the constant go away because they're all being multiplied by 0, and I just get negative 3. So my y-intercept is at negative 3. And my last one, my x-intercept, I take that equation and set it equal to 0. Again, my general strategy is try to factor first and then rely on the quadratic formula. If I factor, I can do factoring, all right, because -3 and 1 multiply to give -3, and they add to give -2. I break it up into two smaller questions, and I get +3 and -1 are my x-intercepts. So +3 is there, -1 is there. And now that I have all the important stuff, I know this vertex is where the turn's going to happen, and I can draw my parabola like that. All right, so that's the graph I'd be looking for if this was a skill check. All right, you have your x-intercepts in exactly the right place, y-intercept exactly right, vertex exactly right, and you draw a parabola that hits all 4 of those points correctly. All right, one more example. All right, this one's in vertex form, so we know our vertex is +4, -2 is there. All right, our y-intercept, I'm going to take a little bit of work with the order of operations. I remember to do the exponent first and then multiply. All right, -34, so that's all the way off the screen down there somewhere. And our x-intercepts would be next. We set our equation equal to 0. Again, this one's in vertex form, so I would try to do the square root method. So I'd add 2, divide by -2. That's -1 now. Take the square root. All right. Making sure you don't forget the plus or minus, and then add that 4 to the other side. So it's 4 plus minus the square root of -1. All right, the square root of -1 we learned in a previous unit is the same as I. So there are solutions to this equation, but they're complex solutions with an imaginary number, which means they're not actually going to happen on the real line. So this one means there's no x-intercepts. It's entirely possible, and we'll see why in a second when we graph it. All right, but if you try to solve your equation for x-intercepts and you get something with imaginary answers, that just means there's no real x-intercepts, so no x-intercepts are going to happen. And that makes sense because if this point here is my vertex, and it's either the highest or the lowest point, well, this being negative means it's going to be the highest point, and you just go downward to get to that y-intercept we know is at -34. And then there's no x-intercepts that are possible because I'd have to go upward from that vertex. All right, so it is possible for your graphs to look like this and have no x-intercepts. All right, they'll always have a y-intercept, they'll always have a vertex, but there might not be any x-intercepts. And that, again, that happens when you get an imaginary solution to this intercept equation. All right, so just be aware of that. It is physically possible to not get x-intercepts. All right, so here's one for you to try on your own. All right, it's in vertex form, so go ahead and try to graph this quadratic. And here's a solution I came up with. So vertex, it's in vertex form, so we get +1, -8 for our vertex. All right, it's a little off the scale of the axis I have, but that's about down here at the bottom of my U. All right, y-intercept, I plug in 0. Remember, doing the order of operations, I get -6, which is there. X-intercepts, do the square root method, add 8, divide by 2, so then I can take the square root to cancel out that exponent, not forgetting the plus or minus, and I get 3 and -1 as my x-intercepts. And then knowing that it's a parabola, there's only one possible shape I could draw that connects those 4 dots. All right, so that's how I graph a quadratic, and those are kind of all the things I would expect to be on the skill check. All right, so as you can see, there's a bunch of small steps that go into graphing this. You basically have 3 small problems of finding the vertex, finding the y-intercept, finding the x-intercepts. All right, so there's only going to be 2 graphs on the skill check. All right, one's going to be in vertex form, so it's easier to find the vertex, but maybe you had to solve for the x-intercepts in a specific way. And the other one's going to be in standard form, so a little bit more work to find the vertex, but you have more options for how you solve for the x-intercepts. All right, so they both have their kind of pros and cons, so we're just going to do one of each for the skill check.